Welcome. Hello. I'm Mariana Schaefer, Director of Artist Initiatives at Creative Capital. We are live tonight from Brick Arts Media House in downtown Brooklyn, New York City. Thank you so much, Brick, for hosting us and for making it possible for us to reach out to artists everywhere. Creative Capital supports bold and innovative artists with the Creative Capital Award. We currently have an open application which is free to artists of all disciplines. You can submit your application via our website at apply.creative-capital.org. You should do this by February 29th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Since 1999, Creative Capital has committed over $48 million in project funding and advisory support to 596 projects representing 741 artists, resulting in some of the most powerful and enduring works of art produced in the United States. If you have any questions tonight, you can ask them in our YouTube chat or tweet us at CreativeCap. We've been going around the country the last few months doing information sessions about the Creative Capital Award and the application process, and it's been a really deep dive into the questions and all the requirements. But tonight we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to have a conversation. And we're going to get the perspectives of the folks who really are impacted and who have gone through this process. So we have, tonight, we have Yara Travieso, 2016 awardee, director, and choreographer, yes. And Brent Green, a 2005 awardee, who's a filmmaker. And Ken Chen, who is an author and served as a lead panelist for us in our application process, and probably read 500 applications in the last round.
Between there and like infinity.
Fantastic. One quick note, if you applied last year or if you have applied in previous years, please be aware that our application process and platform has changed. This is really important. You'll need to register again, and we really encourage you to do that sooner rather than later. We also encourage you to apply early. Don't wait till the last minute. You'll be submitting a full application this time, which is also different. You'll be answering key questions, providing 6 work samples, and a full budget. So go on our website, check it out, get started as soon as possible. Fantastic. So, like I said, we're just going to have a conversation tonight. We'll start with you, Brett. Tell us a little bit about your Creative Capital project.
So my Creative Capital project was a handmade animation. It was half hand-drawn, half wood-carved, stop-motion animation called Paulina Hollers that premiered as an artwork at the Getty and at Sundance in 2007 as a film. That's good. That's about
good.
it. Yeah.
We'll get into it a little bit more.
Yeah.
And Yara, tell us a bit about your wonderful project.
So my project was interdisciplinary multimedia work. It was a hybrid between a live performance and a live feature film. So it's essentially a Latin disco pop variety show based on the Greek tragedy of Medea. It was really sort of a dismantling of the original myth to tell it in the perspective of a Latin American immigrant woman. And we did it by employing cameras that broadcasted the whole musical live on television and screens all around the world. And we had a live studio audience that also functioned as the Greek chorus and our film extras. So the whole thing was really a hybrid production, but it was really meant to create an infinite portrayal of this woman and really try to break free from the way she's been portrayed in the past.
Fantastic. And Ken, you are one of our lead reviewers, but you're also an author. Tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days.
So right now I have a Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library, which means that I checked out so many books that I broke the system at the library.
Seriously?
But yes, apparently they had to have a secret meeting without me. But I'm writing a very weird book that's about my going to the underworld to rescue my father who passed away. And when I go to the underworld to return immigrate him across the border, I see in the underworld everyone who's killed by capitalism and colonialism. So it's sort of like a history of the last 500 years of the world. But it's also about death, so whatever.
I can't wait till
We need to talk.
Fantastic, fantastic. Oh yeah, there's
so many
going
things.
on there. Fantastic. So again, our conversation, we're going to hit on some really key topics that come up for applications and for people looking to apply. The first is discipline. So when you apply, you have an option of choosing 2 disciplines. And when we talk to, we've been going around the country talking to artists, and I find sometimes that folks have an existential crisis, like, I don't know what my discipline is. And so that's totally fine to do that. But for our purposes, really the function of choosing a discipline is really about who you want to be reviewing your application. So think really hard about, there's what the final form will be, or what type of work it'll be, and who you really want to be looking at it. So think about it that way, and less about what discipline it falls under. We created this application as a completely interdisciplinary application, and we know that artists are working across disciplines. So this is really just a function to help us manage the application. But Brent and Yada, for you, you're both really interdisciplinary. How would you approach choosing just 2 disciplines? Yada, maybe you can share.
Sure. This is a great question, because I think often we're really overwhelmed by this question, especially artists of our time right now, where we're really mixing everything together. But Creative Capital is so aware of that, and I think that that's something that's in your favor. They really understand the hybrid artist, and on their platform, they have many, many different options of what your discipline is, so it's not limited to the traditional ones that you would think of. But for me, so this work itself really encompassed so many aspects. It was a musical, it was a dance performance, it was a theater performance, it was a experimental film. It was so many aspects. There was a libretto, there was a script for the actors, and there was a score. So there was a lot of parts to it. And when it got down to it, in the application, the most important thing to look at is both, for me, was a twofold. Where is my experience? Where am I coming from? So my background, where is that coming from? And how is the work really being presented? Where's the weight falling in the work itself? So a lot of my work had been in the past, had been more in narrative film and in live performance, either dance or multimedia. So for me, I would choose multimedia performance and experimental film, because this is not a narrative film. It starts to become an experimental film. It's a live film broadcasted. So that's probably how I would sort of go about it. Oftentimes, we want to choose disciplines that are maybe aspirational, which I am guilty of, and I can feel that sense of you want to say, well, I'm also a filmmaker, and I'm also this, and all these things. And obviously, we are so infinite in our practice. We can be and do whatever we are at any given piece and moment or any given project. But I think it's really important to be strategic in the application and really be clear about, for this particular work, what is being represented, and also what is it rooted in for you? Like, where are you coming from? Because that's who's going to be looking at it. So you want people in the communities that would understand the work to be the ones that are getting their hands in the work.
Yeah, that's really great, Yada. And you're bringing up something that I love to tell people that I just take a minute to share, which is that, when people ask, we cannot tell you, and please don't ask us questions about whether or not you should apply. I always say, go with that thing that's in your heart, that's really inspiring you, that you have to make, that you wake up thinking about and you go to sleep thinking about. There's really no way to beat the system. I think when you're passionate about what you want to do, that's what should come out. So I always tell folks to think about that thing that's deep down in the crevice, hiding away, that you think nobody will care about, but that you're really committed to. So that just inspired me to share that nugget that I've been telling folks a lot about today. But what about for you, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, when I got the Creative Capital Award, I'd never shown my work anywhere, and so I applied in film, video, because it just seemed to make sense. But I think that applying, similar to what Yada was saying, like the people who are looking over the applications, I think tend to be, maybe this is a good way of looking at it. A lot of people get the award for disciplines that aren't what they traditionally are known for. Like Titus Gaffar got Creative Capital for a film. So did Kenneth Armstead. So Bahar, like a lot of really great painters have gotten the And so like Titus Kaphar and Kenneth Armstead, who are both really well-known painters and visual artists, applied in film where they had no history. And I feel like that's something that would come up for me now. Like I primarily make moving image work, but I have much more of a visual arts resume. But still, like, if I was to apply with the project right now, I would apply in film because it's going to end up being projected in some sense. So I think going with what the project is as opposed to where people may be more familiar with their work is probably a real smart move.
Yeah. How about for you, Ken? So we're reviewing in our literature category, but you were on a final panel that was highly interdisciplinary. So everybody got a chance to look at work across all disciplines. So we had film folks reading literature folks looking at performance. And I'm curious from your perspective how you think the discipline conversation played out in those final moments.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said so far in that I think there's this aspirational thing, and I think as artists, you think about your discipline through the materiality of your form, but that's actually not what this question is about. It's actually about where do you sit on the institutional landscape. So it's not about like what work you do, it's actually about what institution like are you affiliated with. So I kind of feel like on the one hand, the final review is interesting because you have all these people who have no experience with like avant-garde dance, like sanding off what they think, or whatever. But everyone has a very open mind. They're able to like go with the flow with these things that are often highly experimental. But at the same time, I think artists sometimes do themselves a disservice because they are actually accurately describing the discipline that they're in, but it's not quite right because the question is really about what evaluative criteria do you want. So you might be a poet, and because you do readings, you think you do performance, but the people who read your work are going to be like dance people, or you might be like a painter who does art with documentation, so you put down that you're a photographer, but actuality, like the photo people who are like obsessed with tech stuff or whatever are going to read your work. So you kind of want to think about like what kind of evaluative like infrastructure am I going to be gathering by choosing the discipline.
Right. I think what you brought up too is really interesting, right? Because a lot of, the big thing we talk about, and we'll talk about it a little bit later too, is how is this project in this moment a catalytic moment for you? And I think we really, really value that moment when an artist is like, wow, I've been doing this thing, business as usual, and now I'm really pushing the bounds of practice, pushing the bounds of what I have been doing and moving into something else. And we fund a lot of projects in that way. And typically, I think if we do end up funding more, well-known artists, it's typically for work giving them an opportunity to shift. It's happened a lot. They're public. The people who tell them what to do will say, "Wait, why are you doing film?" But Creative Capital is the home that says, "Yes, you want to pivot. You're a painter and you want to be a dancer. Yes, what do you got?" We're really committed to bold ideas from the big landscape, but also for how the artist is really framing that.
Yeah, I also think like going off of what Ken's saying and thinking back when I applied for this, I never would have. It's a really important thing to realize that every single year Creative Capital gives awards to some really well-known people and some people that no one has ever heard of. And so I think I was saying that when you said what institution you're affiliated with, because really I'd never shown work anywhere before I got the Creative Capital Award. And had I known what Creative Capital actually was, I would never applied. I would have been really intimidated. But I think that every single year you see like, who's that amazing artist that made was making bee sanctuaries in the middle of St. Louis the same year as like Janine Antoni. I can't remember that guy's name. He's awesome. But there's always these just like kind of luminaries next to people who are really brand new. And so if you don't feel associated with an institution, that shouldn't dissuade you. It is actually incredibly bold.
Yeah.
The people picking the projects are really kind of wild, Yeah.
But I think that's a really good point, and I think it's one point to really emphasize. We've heard at times like, oh, this isn't for me, or oh, it's too art worldy, or this. That is absolutely not the case. We get a huge amount of applications, but we're really curious about what the big ideas are and what artists are really grappling with. And I also think I just also want to say we think very broadly about the definition of what an artist is. Like anybody who's creating anything, we have cultural organizing in there, we have comedy in there, we have all sorts of disciplines and approaches. Magicians?
Yeah,
You could be a
magicians.
magician.
No, there were magicians.
There were magicians. There were puppeteers. I mean, they were actually magicians.
Yeah.
But this is really a place to explore. And again, it is highly competitive, but we really want it to feel like everybody should be welcome to apply. And again, we'll go over this a little bit later, but even going through the application process, even if you don't end up getting it, we think builds in some value. But we'll talk about that a little more. Thank you all for that. We are going to move now to my favorite topic, which is work samples. Another, I think at times, and I'll ask y'all to answer this in a little bit, potentially an angsty moment. Again, this is a little bit different this year. We're asking you to submit 6 work samples out of the gate. If you had applied in previous years, it was different. And for me, thinking about the application as a whole, I really think of it as a storytelling project, right? You're weaving a story throughout every aspect of the application. And I would even say for the people who are budget phobic, that for me is also a really incredible space to play with and think about how you're telling a story through numbers and through the budget and who you're including in the project and your values. How are you paying artists? How are you paying yourself? And so work samples is a really, really huge part of this. It can be, work samples can be, we get a lot of questions about this, but it can be from your current work or from past work. We know that some projects are still very much in your head. So really the role of work samples here is really just for us to understand what's your work been in the past, how does it map to what you're saying. That's another really important thing, and I might ask you to talk about this in a moment. There were times when that projects are amazing on paper and then fall short in the work samples, and then work samples that you're just like, this is blowing me away, and then you read the description, you're like, what? They're not even part of the same realm. So really thinking through how you're telling that story. Also, one really important point that I always like to share with everyone, reviewers are looking at a lot of applications. So if you're doing film work that you're presenting or moving or sound, take us right into the action. We don't need titles or long introductions. Take us right in, because if I'm trying to get into the action, even 10 seconds in, I'm already like, moving on to the next. So that's one I really want to emphasize. And the last thing I'll say before I turn over to you, Ken, to talk a little bit about it is really think through how you're ordering your work samples, because oftentimes we go back, we refer to projects, and we might not look at all 6 samples right away. We might just go back to the first or the second to refresh us of what a project is. So really be strategic and think through and really spend some time on your work samples. So Ken, again, having looked at so many projects and also been on our final panel, what advice do you have on the work sample?
This is really tricky because the work sample is like the most important part, obviously, because it's what you do as an artist. And just speaking personally, like the way I evaluated everything is I just had a massive spreadsheet where I had like name, like identifying stuff, the summary, title, and then I just like wrote my notes about the work sample. And so I didn't ignore everything else aside from the work sample, but the work sample definitely took like 99% of my attention. And I think there were a lot of times you could notice like artists whose work samples were really perfect in telling the story of what they're doing, and other times really great artists who kind of sabotage themselves because the work samples are really not appropriate. And I mean, there were a number of times where we actually would encounter artists who were very famous actually, but the work samples were like non-existent. And someone you would assume would be a shoo-in, might not get it. But I feel like work samples, there's like a million little tips. I think one thing is that it's sort of about establishing a kind of plausibility that this project could actually happen and it would be awesome. And a lot of times, for me, the worst part would be someone would have a great pitch and then the work samples would have nothing to do with it. And it would be like, here's my visionary project, and here are 5 things I did that are completely unrelated in a different medium 10 years ago, on a completely different topic. Sometimes people would have work samples that were inaccessible, like it would be someone who had a ton of things and they'd send like a PDF of 1 page of something, or a poster of the thing that was actually an image of the like press materials for their exhibition, but not of the art itself. So what can you do to immediately get to like the materiality of the work? And kind of, if you're a visual artist, think about like if someone couldn't be there, like what would it be to be, you know, in that space, which is particularly difficult if your thing is like durational, if it is social practice. So what are ways you can have documentation about things that are like by definition ephemeral? So like in performance, that's something where we had to kind of be very understanding, because the more you get to like experimental dance or things like that, the documentation is just really weak. Not like the work itself is great, but it's usually someone with like an iPhone standing in the corner of a room. There's also a lot of like little nitty-gritty things, like people would submit like links to Vimeo that were password protected and not provide the password.
Please avoid using passwords whenever possible. If you remember maybe 3 things tonight, that's a really big one, because it happens really often. Unless you really, for questions of security or or whatever the issue is, need to protect your work, of course. But otherwise, it will make your application go much smoother if you avoid providing passwords.
There's also a link in Vimeo that you
private link.
Yeah, and so you can send just the link, and they don't need the password.
Thank you for that.
It's a
That's
private
fantastic
link
tip.
on Vimeo. So you just, it's just the link, and then there's no barrier.
No need for
But
password.
no one else will find it if they do a search.
Got it. That's really great information. Okay, we will post that somewhere.
I use that for everything.
I mean, you do have to put I mean, this is not fair, but you have to put yourself in the perspective of someone on the reviewer side, where there literally are just like hundreds of applications, each one of which has like 6 attachments, each one of which could be like 30 pages long. So it can be a little overwhelming. So I think the thing is, you want to make your work seem unified, and you know, you don't have to include everything you've ever done. You don't have to include things that make sense in this project, but actually are not your best work. So I feel like I'm saying really generic things, but lead with your best work.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I will say a couple of things. We know, again, as I said before, you might not have work samples for your current work, but I think to your point, Ken, it's like, how do you put together something that is understandable, right? How do you weave together a story? And then also another thing you can do on the video front is just timestamp, right? Start from minute 1:45, to 1 whatever. It's 3 minutes that you get for moving image film. So how do you, again, because you're both so interdisciplinary, how do you approach the work sample? And I think also for performance work, it's really challenging to get strong documentation. It's expensive to do it really well. Any thoughts there, Yada, about?
Yeah, I mean, I know the struggle is real when you're trying to show live performance on camera, and I know it's really tough. I'm lucky because I'm a filmmaker and I'm also a stage director. However, it's a very different language when you're showing a clip from a film work versus a theatrical work. Something I know for a fact, I got Creative Capital because of my work sample. I know that for a fact. Reading back at everything and being part of the community now, it's really wild. Like the proposal I gave is insane. Like, I want to do a musical. It's going to be a live television show. It's going to be broadcasted all around the world. My family in Cuba is going to watch. Everyone all around the world is going to watch it, and they're going to be interacting and tweeting, and we're going to be putting text in the actual show where people are, it was just like insane, an insane proposal. It was very clear, but it was so ambitious. It was just such a big idea that I had been pitching this over and over for years, and it really was just not, no one was opening any doors. And I had asked a question to my friend Kyle Abraham, who's also a Creative Capital winner. I was like, he was on a panel and I didn't get an award, and I said, what's up, what's happening? He's like, well, because you're a filmmaker, your work sample is highly edited, and this is for a live performance. And it's really hard to capture the essence of something live when you're cutting all the time, so it feels more like a trailer. So it feels like a highly produced thing where we can't get the essence of what it is to be live. And as we know as theater makers, it is a very vulnerable experience to see your very present work all of a sudden like dulled and muted by a screen, and it's not present anymore. And that's totally realistic feeling that you feel where you want to just cut it up or change it or try to make it as live as possible. But the truth is that the people that are watching your work are very familiar with that. So to choose the part of the work that really does resonate the closest to you, the part that you are actually in love with, the part that says something that really communicates the thing you were wanting to communicate, don't be scared to really take that part and really present that part to us. And even if it's like a 2-minute straight through or 1.5 minute plus another 1 minute, just the sustainedness of it, we really get to understand what your work is about, how it unravels, and how you tell the story you're telling. And I think that confidence and just like lean in to the work that you have and trust that, that there's something important there. I think that's really important. I also, for me, because it was such a wild, large idea, and I had never done anything live television or live broadcasting, and so it was really like a pitch in the dark. I was like, I hope that you trust me to be able to do this massive thing. And I had never done anything this big. But the thing that really helped, and I was lucky enough to have a residency right here at Brick, where I actually did my premiere for Medea. And I had a residency early on. It was just a week-long residency. But in that residency, I was able to really test out a lot of the technical aspects of the work without having a script, without having any music. I mean, it was just bare bones, but we were able to test out the hardest part of this work, which was how are we gonna make a camera live TV with theater audiences? How are we gonna have audiences be film extras? And how is this gonna be broadcasted? So we just did basically like a tech test. And I know a lot of people don't have that luxury or that resource. So it really isn't about having a test of what you're gonna make. It's about showing the pieces of how this will come together. So the pieces of a film work with a live work and the two best versions of that I could possibly find. And that's what was presented. But also the thing that really got me to the next level was a sustained scene. Yeah. I showed a sustained scene that was really intimate, was very vulnerable, and that was like at the core of the work. I didn't show the scene that was like the cleanest. I showed the scene that was like the vulnerable one, the one that was like at the gut of everything, and I let it play out for 3 minutes and I walked away.
It was still probably shot well, right? You still
it was shot well. Yes, it was as the better footage you can acquire in your work in general, the better you can, like really invest in getting really good footage of your work, photos of your work. It will really take your work to the place that it should be.
One thing I want to offer too that often happens is compilations are not a great use of your work sample real estate. Also trying to beat the system with the PDF that has 6 photos in it. Like, please don't do that. Don't do that. Really, really, really be judicious with that space. Don't try and beat the system. And again, to your point, Edit, like again, still going back to the gut, like the gut in this scenario, I think really means a lot. How do you approach work samples? I have seen some of yours on our website, some clips from the film. Yeah. But the film wasn't done yet, and so you had to show something, right? And I think there's space probably there is space for sketches, mock-ups, things like that, even just an idea of how you think something will flow. That is, again, to show the movement, to show what's happening. I think it is also compelling.
Yeah, I mean, for this, like, because I hadn't made a ton of stuff for Creative Capital, I made like basically a completely separate film that told what the story of this film would be. I made like I'm not suggesting other people do this. You probably have other things to do, but
get another grant so you can get the funding for that.
My stuff's really homemade, and it doesn't cost any money. And so I made a thing where like the main character from the story told the story of what was going on, like a claymation thing of him moving, and showed the sets and showed storyboards, and it was a real compelling film. Like at the first retreat, people were like, "That should be the film," and I was like, "No." But also beyond that, getting the first Creative Capital grant, like I really, really go out of my way to document like everything, like every museum exhibit, like the performances, like again, like I have access, like I do a lot of live cinema stuff, and often end up in often enough end up in spaces where they'll do like multi-camera shoots and send me all the footage, and I'll cut together. Again, it is the thing from beginning to end, so I'm not showing a collage, but things that are really beautifully made and feel powerful all on their own, like no iPhone stuff, like gallery shows, museum shows. I bring in photographers and cinematographers who I really like, who are really, really good in their own right to film things that then I go and try to cut together into a compelling thing. It feels somewhat crass and lousy to say, but the way that your, especially visual art, the way that an exhibit is documented is kind of at least as important as the exhibit itself. Many more people.
It's the document of like the thing
Definitely.
happened. But one thing I really like about what you're saying, Brett, because obviously not everyone has resources to do the thing, but I think what you're sharing is that, you know, at this first iteration, you sort of did a thing at home, you made it work, it was compelling, you brought sort of your passion to it, and as you've gone on in your career, you've been able to have better access and resources to document. So I want everyone to remember that you don't need all the bells and whistles, but what you really need is some like really thoughtfulness around how you're doing. Like, you know, the iPhone isn't always great, but if that's what you have, put it on a tripod or whatever the thing is. Like, really be thoughtful and intentional.
And color corrected in Premiere, and like, and try to do a good job with the sound. And I think that Mariana's point of trying to make everything tell a story is really, really, like, you know, I felt like an enormous stroke of luck that I was able to get the Creative Capital Award so early on in my career. But I remember thinking that I don't have this like fancy resume or anything, and so I had to make every single question in it. I specifically remember trying to write a story that was just compelling from beginning to end, where you're kind of just being like, I want to hang out with that guy, you know. And so that was every single question. I tried to make its own self-contained story that felt compelling and interesting, and I agree that does go down to the budget,
I really like that. That's
And,
nice.
and to go with what you're saying, I mean, I think that when you're submitting a work sample, it feels like it has to be very formal and official, and you know, it does, but it does. But well, I mean, you're like, oh, I have to have these things that I already publish, or the show I already had. But there's this weird way where the Creative Capital grant's kind of like a project grant, so it's almost like applying, like you're doing a small business, but it's your art project. So you're trying to be like, this is proof of concept for the cool thing that I could do. So like, sometimes there would be someone who didn't have a huge CV, but then they would have like really cool plans in their work sample. So they hadn't written their novel or done their immersive, you know, 3D augmented reality, you know, Penguin movie or something, you know, whatever. But they sent all the mock-ups, the screenplay, the like molds. So I think there's a way where even if you don't feel like you have a lot of like work behind you, you can kind of make that up by showing how thoughtful you are and how much you fleshed out the whole world of your project. If only you had that, you know, capital lying around to fund it.
I think it also is in looking at work samples, and we'll move on to the next thing, but I also really appreciate when there's a flow from sort of image to sound to video, if it exists, right? I know, you know, you did a lot of literature, that's not always the case, but if there are moments, like for an exhibition, right? What I really liked about visual art, for example, are the moments where I could see a work up close and understand the texture, but then also move out, to your point, Brent, and really see like where was it placed in the gallery, or if it's a work that's happening outside, or even as you mentioned, you know, some socially engaged work, like what is the movement of what are the movements of the people? Like how are people gathering? What's the movement? And there's incredible still images you could have, but wow, it's really great to see a video of people moving, and then maybe there's a script about what everyone was saying. So again, I think that richness.
And I feel like a lot of the visual art, straight visual art things, it is all photographs, but I felt like we learned how underwhelming photographs can be for like a lot of other things. And there were a ton of things that were like socially engaged work or art that's about like taking over site, where there was no documentation that made it so you had a sense of what is the social reality of the work itself. Like I'm gonna occupy this X, Y, and Z place for 10 years, you know, and see what it's like. But you just have a photograph of the empty space.
Yeah.
But what are the people going to be like?
Yeah.
The audience,
Yeah,
the
the point
people
of view
involved.
is
Yeah.
the point of view is huge, and I think
Yeah.
actually reading back in my application, I was very clear as to what is the point of view, like what is this angle, and because my work is in between, the camera angle is actually one of the ways you could watch it, but it's also the live version. Live is another angle. So I definitely had two options where I said, this is what viewers at home are going to be seeing. This is the camera point of view. This is viewers in the theater. This is what
Yes.
they see. So really breaking apart the context and the point of view
Yeah.
of how the work, especially more hybrid artists, that we're recontextualizing theater, we're recontextualizing film, and we're sort of like rethinking of how this is performed and how are people experiencing it. So if you have a project where someone's looking at it through a tiny little peephole, then we need to see those people leaning into
Yeah.
the peephole and what is the context of that work, because it's really putting the pieces together to understand how intimate this is, or
Right.
how not intimate this is, to really understand the guts
Right,
of everything.
exactly.
And I think honestly, there's a joy to this process too. It could feel like a little bit intimidating or overwhelming, but I think that there's a joy to this process, because as you look back at your work, you can literally just go back to the work and find the parts that really just speak to you and speak to you at your core, and you can be proud of that and like really present it and share it in a generous spirit, not in a sort of fearful, I want to impress someone, but more,
That's right.
this is something that I created from an inside out place, and I'm really excited to have it on the out now in a bigger way. It's a celebration of your work, and so find the parts that really make you feel like you want to celebrate this moment, you know, and I think that really speaks to the work itself, because if the work that you're proposing is coming from that same place, then those work samples are just going to really read into that. Yeah.
And I think that's a really good point. You know, we're so lucky to have two really incredible interdisciplinary artists, but you were really reviewing like straight literature. And I also just want to share with everybody that we love all types of work, right? So we find a lot of just straight literature, right? And you know, Ken was really amazing at sharing with us like what is the nuance in literature, in a book or in a text that is bold and innovative. So for folks who aren't necessarily, you know, mixing everything together, there's still space within a really, you know, more a confined genre frame to also be bold and imaginative. So I don't want everyone to come away thinking that we're just funding all the interdisciplinary things with all, you know, the bells and whistles. But
yeah, I mean, it's tricky because it's true that the literary pieces are not like someone dressing up as a termite and like entering cyberspace while beaming themselves to the moon, which is what a lot of the other creative capital things are like. But I mean, I kind of see creative capital as like being important on the landscape of culture because it's supporting experimental work.
Yeah.
And the literature pieces have always tended to be experimental also. So within the realm of literature, it's also very different from what you'd see from a big five publishing house usually,
Yeah.
in that the work is doing something that's difficult or illegible or challenging. But what I would say is I feel like a prospective applicant to creative capital might be like looking at the people who've gotten it in the past and be like, oh, well, you know, I'm just doing this thing I really believe in. I'm not like building an AI that will solve world hunger by sending haikus to a satellite dish that I
Are
built.
these all
and-
projects that like got?
I have this Creative Capital Mad Lib that's been permanently. I got it installed at the Creative
do,
Capital
like,
headquarters.
mashups, right?
Yeah. But I think the thing is that like if there are past Creative Capital awardees whose work you like, and if you feel like your work is different than the status quo, it doesn't have to be like so like ostentatiously quirky, as long as you can express to yourself what feels new or different
Yeah.
about it. And I think this is a great point about starting from a place of love, because I think that everyone is kind of like used to and exhausted by this sort of like grant application treadmill.
Yes.
And sometimes I felt really sad because I felt like there were projects I thought were actually good, but the person didn't know how to write the application. Or inversely, things where the application was better written than maybe the actual project. But I feel like part of that thing is like getting this process about expressing like how you feel like what you're doing is special or unique, and so in a way you don't have to be so you don't have to internalize the system. You can kind of think about like how, I feel like the condition of any artist usually is you feel like alone, and you're like, you know, sometimes angry at the world, sometimes like internalizing it. But there's a weird way where you can flip that around and be like, you know, all the world that has rejected my brilliance, you know, it's because I'm innovative in these ways. You know, I don't know if this makes sense psychoanalytically, but you know, something.
That'll be the next show.
Do something with this.
Okay, how do we psychoanalyze the artist brain? This is a perfect segue to the next sort of big bucket that we talk a lot about with prospective applicants is the project description. And I think, you know, again, this going from the gut and being really committed to an idea, and really, I think, trying as much as possible to bring your voice into it. For us, we are really interested, again, as I mentioned, how is this project catalytic or a shift in your work? And also, a really big question that we say is why you, why now? Why are you the right person to do this project in this moment? I will also say something that I think came up in panel is if you're using different medium, VR, performance, really make a case for why this medium is the right medium for this thing. Or you can make the case for, I'm exploring the medium for this thing, but here's what I think it should be, right? It's something that's also come up, which we talk a lot about, and we share with everyone, a little bit to your point, is really not to use jargon. And that is not at the expense, I don't want it to be misinterpreted as sort of dumbing down, right? Because there are, you know, we know that artists have rich work practices and research practices and have spent a lot of time committed to practice and understanding fields and forms. But I think what we're really getting at is just how to most clearly articulate your work in a way that everyone can understand it. You know, that someone who is more familiar with literature, if they're reading about Yada's project, that Yada doesn't go deep into sort of performance speak to a point where it's sort of, you're not able to understand. So I just wanted to be, you know, to clarify that a little bit. And really, again, you know, part of what the instructions that we give, we know that not everybody, you know, in some way, there's a whole machine now around grant writing, right? And so sometimes what happens is things that are well written sort of mask the work, but we are really committed to making sure that even if something isn't like super polished, super perfect, what's really coming up, what we ask reviewers to look at is what is the bold idea coming through, and sort of look past, you know, of course we want you to take time and be thoughtful about what you're writing, but we're not really so much interested is, you know, is it perfectly polished, ready for publication piece. And I'm curious for you, Ken, what worked well in project descriptions?
Project description is really important, and so it's basically like you have like a paragraph or a few sentences to explain what your project is. And I mean, it's kind of interesting because as someone who used to run a nonprofit called the Asian American Writers Workshop, I would apply for grants all the time. But thinking about it as an individual, I think as an artist, it's very hard to write a project description if you're not used to it, because you're like alienating yourself from your work. Because your work might start from a very internal, emotional place. It might happen very organically. You might not know why you do this certain motion or this certain type of image that attracts you. And so something like a project description might feel kind of painful because you actually have to externalize it and describe it from the point of view of like the other looking at you instead of from the point of view of creation. And I also think that there's this pressure where it's like this critique of, there was a while when writers were doing projects that were just like cool art projects, and people were like, well, this is just sort of like the ultimate fate of capitalism, where like any project is just something you can sum up with like a cool gimmick. The project description is sort of like the elevator pitch of your project. But I think the way I would think about it is like maybe to start at a very basic level and just be like, what literally am I doing at the most literal level? And that does not mean on a dumb level, but there are sometimes projects that are like, this is, and there'll be 15 different types of arts, you know, and nouns, and it's actually unclear. Just figure out at a very fundamental level, like what the project is. And I know this sounds insane, but I think it helps if you can, maybe when you do your application, take a piece of paper and write just all the nouns involved in your application, and then figure out what is the story behind that. And it doesn't have to be very aspirational. The project description doesn't have to capture like your greatness as an artist. It just has to be a very simple shorthand. So when later there's like 100 applications, the people reviewing can go back to it and be like, oh, that was the immersive theater piece that involved like sovereignty issues and gender, and had this really cool use of like performance in this way. Like, think of it not as like a be-all and end-all that encompasses everything, but like a shorthand that is very direct.
And that's something too for us. Again, the project description becomes a way for you to articulate what the big idea is, but I think as both of you have experienced, once you get the Creative Capital Award, you can pretty much do anything you want. We've had, awardees who started, I think, in literature and went to theater, or have started in something else and morphed. So really, this is just an opportunity to share the idea, and we know that things change and shift. I'm curious for both of you. Well, Yadi, I want you to repeat how you described your project, because Ken's saying like distinct, clear, and the way you did it earlier was so. Yeah. You can do it again.
La Medea, it's true, because I mean, it really does, it sums it up. It's wild and it's complicated, but it's a very clear image. La Medea is a Latin disco pop variety show, shot, broadcasted, directed in real time with a live studio audience. So it's essentially, that's it. It's complicated, but it's direct. I think what you said was really lovely, because I think that we often, as artists, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves for this, like, 3 sentences, whatever, 4 sentences, whatever it is, to really, present all of us. But something I really often think about and I think is very successful is when you consider your work almost like a North Star that and the essence of your work as like this thing you're walking towards. You're never gonna get the North Star, you're never gonna touch it. It's just a guiding light. So if you really consider every question, like what Mariana's saying, like as what is the North Star? What is guiding you through this application? What is guiding the work? What is the essence of the work? And that comes both from where it comes from yourself, but also what is guiding the work technically? What is guiding the work like physically? How does the essence of the work come to life with an actual literal components? And so if you consider, really take the pressure off you and really think about the generosity of the work, how do you feed the work? How do you take care of it so it can come to life? Well, think about it like that. Have like as much love for the actual project or essence of the projects as possible. And sometimes what I like to do, I like to think of myself as a human, not as an artist when I write these things, or as an academic, and I think to really think of yourself as a human writing. Sometimes I like to, when I'm really stuck and I can't get there, I remember I found it, for Creative Capital, I had done like a free writing in my journal, the one where I write all my feelings in. So I did like a free writing, and that journal is really about me. It's like about my feelings as a human, not as an artist pitching something. And what I was able to do was what you're talking about, those nouns, that idea. It's like really just getting in a way that feels lovely and generous to yourself, not difficult or like, this is work, but in a way that felt good. Like I was able to like write about the things about the work that I was excited about, the things about the work that were moving me and why they were moving me. And I just messy. And from that, I could sort of like pick out what the essence of this work is and how can I be as generous as possible to the work so that I can describe it as clearly as possible to someone that doesn't know it. This isn't about me. Now this is about this thing that I'm making. And how can I be generous to this thing? I now have to explain, there's going to be 3 cameras, there's going to be, I really have to break it down so that I can actually make this thing happen. And I think that's really, really, really helpful. Yeah.
One thing that's really important for Creative Capital that's really unique is we really like work that takes a long time to make. We're okay if the project that started as one thing becomes another thing. And takes 3 to 5 years. And I would actually say that we prefer work that takes longer amount of time to complete. So when you see that question on the application, that's what it's about. We say it can't be completed by a certain date. That doesn't mean complete it by that date. We mean go beyond that. Recently at an orientation, I have 2 small children, so I have young, kids' books around, and we have a book at our house called Slowly, Slowly Sloth. And it happened to be out the day we were talking with the new awardees, and I read, very naively maybe, to a group of amazing artists. I read Slowly, Slowly Sloth. But the point is that slow down. You know, so many of our artists have really benefited from the pacing and taking their time and really rethinking and going back to so we really encourage that piece of it. How do you, for you, Brent, and timing, not necessarily maybe with your Creative Capital project, but with other projects, how do you approach the timing and how did it happen for you?
I mean, they're all really different, but I do think that one of the massive benefits of a project getting out into the world, of it taking time, obviously, like, kind of the more time you spend with your hands on something, the better it's going to end up being. But also, Creative Capital, really the most valuable part of the award, I would guess 100% of the awardees would say, are the retreats where you go and you show your work to all of these programmers and curators and all these people. And the more institutions who get behind your work as it's being built, the more like invested parties there are in a piece, the bigger impact it's more likely to have in terms of like the audience it reaches. And so maybe that's a big part of it is as you're developing it, if it's a really, if it's a type of project that really attracts a lot of people, my experience has been you'll get all these other really great organizations behind you who feel personally invested in making sure the world gets out into the world, and that's unbelievably valuable, as opposed to just like throwing something on a screen and hoping someone shows up, you know?
That's a really important point. I think that's one thing that's really unique about the Creative Capital process and award, and that's something that we ask about in the application, and it really shouldn't be overlooked as an afterthought. Really, how can you benefit from these non-monetary services? We have a retreat where artists present their work. We have an orientation. We think we're really good at connecting you to folks in the field and making things happen, but also the basics, right? Like I maybe need some help with social media, or I need to figure out a financial plan, or so many different things. How do I negotiate maternity leave? Like there's so many things that we can be helpful with. So that is an important piece of the application. This has been an incredible conversation. We could go on probably for another hour. I would love to go on for another hour with you all. But I also, I think we have a lot of people watching this evening, and I'd love to open it up for some questions from out there. So through the wonderful power of technology, I'm going to be getting some questions. But before we do that, one quick note that's really important that we get lots of questions about is collaborators. And none of your projects are collaborative projects, but really, really take a moment to look on our website and look on the actual application about how we define collaborators. Collaborators are parties who have equal pieces of the project, who have equal intellectual contribution. It's really a distinction between work for hire, yada. I mean, you had many, many people work with you on your project, and those are more work for hire. As we've been talking about, Creative Capital is really expansive and really open, but what you apply with, so if you apply as an individual, that's who will be named as the awardee. If you apply as a collaborative, that's what will be named. Unfortunately, we can't shift that. So really, we're really encouraging everyone to really pay attention to that collaborative piece. Another thing that's really important is really make sure that you're adding all of our emails to your inbox so that you're not missing correspondence from us. And we've put a timeline on the website so that you know when you might be hearing from us. So if it's around a time when you might be hearing from us, be on the lookout, look at spam. We had a few folks who missed opportunities because of their spam folder, and unfortunately, think about that.
Can I say a thing?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so one thing I see over and over with friends, every year I get tons and tons of friends applying for it, and you read them over, you know, and in terms of the budget, I feel like it goes against sort of like every artist nature to pay themselves well. And it was explained to me, because I didn't do that in my budget when I got this, a really simple way that it was put to me was if you don't pay yourself an appropriate amount in your budget, people will look at it and think that it's too easy for you to be swept away to do something else to get money. So like when you're filling out your budget, I think that part's really, really important, is to make it like a real legitimate budget that pays yourself well.
Yes, that's critical for sure. Let's see if we have other questions coming through from out there. I'm waiting.
I feel like the
yeah.
budget is a part that like scares everyone.
Yeah.
Because it involves math. But I think people are also really uncomfortable talking about money. But paying yourself is a big one. I also feel like the budget is more important the more it involves sort of like other people and producing things in the real world. So on like film, performance, social practice, these things where there are more like real deadlines and real objects entering the world, the budget is more important. I kind of felt like people were less obsessed with the budget if it was like you're a painter or like you're a poet or something, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think artists are not used to thinking about how to like alienate their own stuff into a balance sheet or a projection.
And they say, I could get it done for this.
Don't
Maybe.
sell yourself short.
Yes, don't do that.
Keep the dream
Don't
alive
do
in the
that.
budget.
Yeah.
If it takes $3 million, put that down.
Pay your collaborators the amount that they should receive. Pay yourself the amount you should receive. Think about it at hourly rate. It's huge, and it's really a practice. Think of it as a practice in self-worth. It's important.
We have a question coming about, does the project have to premiere in the US? Does it have to be US-based? Absolutely not. Please, you can check our criteria for who's eligible for the award, but really the work can take place anywhere, even in space. We do have some artists who work with NASA, the Jet Propulsion Lab, so there are things potentially happening in space. But really, it can happen anywhere. It's just a matter of how we can get funds to artists, and that's really where the restrictions lie. So please check those out if you have questions about if you're eligible. And I would also really encourage everybody to really before they reach out to us, we are a small and mighty team. And last year we had over 4,000 applications. So we're really making a behemoth effort to get to everyone's questions. But it helps us immensely if you really go through our website. We have a lot of resources like what we're doing tonight. We have FAQs, things about timing. So make sure to check those out and really look thoroughly before you reach out to us. And we're always happy to be helpful, but we appreciate so much your patience and as we get through all the questions. And speaking of questions, are there other questions that are coming through on our feed?
Can I say something while we wait for a question?
Yeah.
So there's something really major about Creative Capital team really thinks of the artist, and the application is in the point of view of artists. It is actually an amazing opportunity to work through your project in a way that, honestly, like even now, like for the works that I'm doing now, if I look back at those questions, like these are great questions for me to develop the work that I'm developing right now, because it's so thoughtfully framed for artists. I don't know any application that really frames these questions for artists, and the way that they're organized one after the other. They really are thoughtful about how our creative process works, and the team itself is so thoughtful. So I think that there's so much generosity on that website alone, and really think about it as like a way to really flex the muscle of what this work is about for you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We have a question about if you're a student or have a full-time job. What we're really interested is a commitment to practice and a commitment to the project. We know that there are other projects that come up, different jobs happening. We understand that. We know things take time. There are stipulations about being a full-time student. Please look for those on our website. And that's really just about if you're a student, you're benefiting from all of the resources that a university has to offer. So we ask that by the time you get the award, you're not enrolled in a full-time granting program. So, but we do have a lot of information about that. And one question that's coming up that's really critical, and we're thinking hard about this because of our scale, is feedback. And so, a couple of things about feedback. Unfortunately, we're not able to give feedback if you don't advance. You do get feedback if you get to the final round. We're really diligent about that. But again, for us, it's a question of scale. So it's something that we're still grappling with 4,000 applications. How do we provide feedback? Also, not all reviewers are as amazing and wonderful as Ken, who writes a novel after everything he reviews. Sometimes there's really critical information, sometimes they're not. So we're not able to do this. So
there was another question
Yeah.
that looped up about if anything was off limits.
That we get that question a lot, and
Just put them towards narcissist.
narcissist, exactly. I don't want to answer that question because
sorry.
no, it's not that I don't want to answer. I mean, I'm saying I don't want to answer because I don't think I have the right answer to that question. I think, again, share with us your bold, innovative idea.
And check out Narcissist's
And
work.
check out Narcissist's work and others. It's really, it's hard to it's a tricky question about what's off limits because there's many, many, many considerations. So I would just say go with what you're passionate about, what you want to put forth in the world, what's bold, and just go forth and be committed to that. There's another question about explaining the difference between a premiere venue, physical community. This is really so we have a question on the application that asks about where your work is taking place. And again, we understand this changes, but it's really a question for us to get grounded on where the work lives. And I think this is particularly important for projects that are socially engaged. Like, is it taking place in a community with people, or is it meant to be screened in a theater? Is it meant to be done really anywhere, everywhere, outdoors, indoors? So that question is really just about where is it living, where is it placed. The other questions that we're getting, the Creative Capital Award provides $50,000 in funding over the time of your projects, and the funds are dispersed at strategic and key moments across the project. And then there's all of these other resources about equivalent of $50,000 for all of these support services. But really, when you're thinking about the budget should be what your project costs. If you're sending a rocket into space, whatever that $1 billion number is, put that down, and our $50,000 award is going to get you to maybe write down what the project is. But it can be over it doesn't have to be, please don't, unless your project really costs just $50,000, really think through what it actually is going to cost. And that's also, I think, in the review process, a real indicator of an understanding an artists have as to whether or not they can execute the project. We know there are unknowns, but you probably went and figured out, like, how do I do a live stream? How much does a 3-camera shoot cost? So there are things like that. How many people apply for the award? So last year, we had over 4,000 applications. In the year before, over 5,000. So it is a very competitive award, but as you were saying, Yada, I think part of the way we structured the application is to really add value, and just by doing it, we're hoping that you're getting some insight. The other thing that often happens is as you go through the process, you might land on a reviewer who loves your work, and it's happened before where they just reach out and say, your thing is really cool. I don't know what's happening with the award, but let's talk. So
it's free advertisement.
Exactly. And the other thing we should say is we've had some awardees that have applied 6 times. So, people have been very precious. Yada says she applied 3 times. Very precious, like, I don't know if I want to apply this year, and just apply. If you have the time and the energy and you want to go through the process, apply. You might apply again next year. And then, another question that comes up a lot, if I applied last year, can I use the same application? That is a question we can't answer for you. Again, really put forth if that's the project you want to put forth and you were like, I'm sending something to the moon and I didn't have any resources to do that, this is still the project I want to do, that makes sense. If it's a project that is time sensitive and required things to happen in between and they didn't happen, that's a different story. And so just thinking through that. Another question is what was the thing you learned the most about getting the award?
Do you want to go?
Oh God, no. I mean, I was when I got the award, I was 26, and I didn't go to college at all. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania. It changed like my whole outlook of the world. Oh, maybe this is a good thing. It was the first time I'd ever been part of a community that is anything. There is no community that's even remotely like the Creative Capital community. It's so unbelievably generous. I think it made me care about people and what they were thinking about in a way that I could not have seen coming even remotely before I became part of the community.
I agree. I think oftentimes, you know, I don't know, everyone has a different practice and process, but I'm alone a lot. Writing a script, writing grants, you know, that's a big part of our job. And I'm often by myself. And one of the things I had put in my application was, you know, I crave a community of people that are doing work that doesn't really quite fall in the traditional spaces. I went to a very strict conservatory, and I was always in spaces either like film world or dance or theater, and I didn't really have a community of artists in any of those spaces. So this was an amazing opportunity to really bond. It feels like a family, and it really is true. Like, it really changes your whole outlook on how you make and network in family and communication and community. And I think that was major, and also just the support. Honestly, for me, the financial advisor support that the website had changed the whole way I take care of myself and my practice and my work and my collaborators. And that really shifted the way I see the holistic sense of our practice.
What are some other really quick, the non-monetary things that you may have used along the way, if you did?
Oh man, there were a whole bunch of things. I mean, you know, at the retreat, you show your work the first year. When you get it, you do a 7-minute presentation. I wasn't really familiar with sort of what the art world was like at all. And when I finished my presentation, there were, you know, people wanted to show my work at all kinds of fancy places, and that was really neat. I had a career advisor, Ella Troiano, who's like an incredibly great experimental filmmaker, who was there to help me think through a lot of opportunities as they were coming in. Because she's this wild experimental filmmaker that then suddenly was able to make TV and things like that. She has a giant range of experiences. And, you know, with the just friends that came through that, like when I first got the award, I mean, like I had my first gallery show in New York because another awardee took my work into his gallery and said, "This guy's great, you should show it here." Like it's just a never-ending list of just, like, the community is really just there to champion each other's work.
Yeah.
It's really,
it is never-ending too.
It
like
is
it just
never-ending.
continues and continues.
Yeah.
You know, it's really a community, and it's going to be there for the long haul. And when I say generous, like I email them and they respond with thoughts, and we collaborate, and I can go in for a brainstorm. It is a community. It becomes your art church, because, you know, oftentimes we're like, you know, trying to make it work with this job and this gig and this thing, but then there's nowhere to really go to and feel like there's a sanctuary for you. There's a safe space where you can sort of like explore and ask questions. So it really does feel like that. And as far as like the other resources go, the financial advisor changed the way I really function. You know, it really sort of helped heal a lot of my past patterns. It was amazing. And I think along with that, time management was huge. I mean, there's just so like a limitless. I had legal advice that was really major when it comes to like intellectual property. So there's just a lot of things, and I think the retreat is probably at the center of it. It is just such an incredible experience to really present your work to a group of people that are here for you. The context of that experience, of everyone there to support you and figure out how they can help, is like nothing else.
And I really, really love that you centered the community aspect. And that is a question that we ask on the application also, because it's so critical and important to what we do, is really wanting to be a part of community. And not everybody is craving that or needs that, and that's great. But being a Creative Capital awardee means being part of a community, means being generous with your fellow awardees, being generous with the community. You mentioned Ella. Ella was a 2000 awardee, and she still works with us today, working with artists.
I talked to her yesterday.
You talked to her. See, you talked to her yesterday. So that is what we're building here. Exactly. See. That's what we're building here, and that's also really important part of the application, is to really share with us how you want to be a part of that community and what you think you have to offer and what you also hope to gain. I'm noticing that we've gone a little bit past our hour mark again because we want to just keep talking and talking. But we will, I think we'll end it there. I want to thank you all so much for this incredibly rich conversation there. You always say it better than we do. We always lead with the artists, and it really, really rung true tonight. So thank you so much for bringing the passion for your work and the passion for what Creative Capital offered you and how you've contributed. And we really, really want to say thank you to Brick House. To really huge thank you to Brick House and the team here who has made this evening possible and who is helping us. We're doing some other online workshops here through Brick, so really, really, really thrilled to be able to work with you over multiple sessions. One thing that I wanted to share, if you saw us last year, Robin Frohart was one of the artists on the panel, and I am so thrilled to share that her plastic bag store project is going to Times Square in March, March 18th to be precise, and it's being hosted by Times Square Arts. So you should definitely check it out, and if you're in New York, but also, you can catch up with all of our artists on our website. We do interviews. There's always new information about what's happening with our artists around the country and around the world. Our website, again, is creative-capital.org. Visit us there. And again, thank you all so much. Thank you to the viewers out there for your questions and your attentiveness. And we'll see you next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you.